I'm Dusty Deschamps. I'm a fifth generation Missoula native. My family first moved here in the 1870s. And the property that we're filming this on today is part of my dad's ranch that we moved to in 1945. So I've lived here all my life, basically. Uh, I have quite a bit of information about the history of Missoula in general, and I'd like to go back a long ways before the white man came to this country, because this area was kind of a natural migration route for the indigenous Indians of this particular area, in particular the Salish, Kootenai, the Pend Oreille, the Nez Perce, who were pretty much west of the mountains tribes, although they did travel a lot to the plains in eastern Montana to hunt buffalo. About 1600, an amazing thing happened that revolutionized the lives of American Indians. Horses appeared. Horses appeared about 150 years before any white men did, but this made travel throughout the North American continent dramatically easier than it had been in what was previously called the dog days, when you had to go either by foot or at most with a travois pulled by a dog. After the advent of the horse, about 1620 in this area, there became a lot more travel through this particular canyon here. At the same time, there was pressure coming from the East Coast on Midwestern tribes that were being pushed further west, and this led to a lot of intertribal conflict and warfare in the 16, 17, and 1800s. And again, this valley was kind of a focal point for a lot of those ambushes, because as the local Indians would be heading east to hunt buffalo, some of the more eastern tribes, in particular the Blackfeet, resisted this pressure that was coming from the west as well as pressure coming from the east. And a lot of battles occurred in this valley just below us, which eventually became known as Hellgate Canyon. This was basically the main migration route east and west between southern Idaho and up into Canada. So there was a lot of traffic through here. The area that we're sitting in right now is in just east of the saddle of Mount Jumbo. These were shaped by a lot of historical, a lot of prehistoric factors. Glacial Lake Missoula backed up in here numerous times. There's ponds on the top of the saddle that were created by the wash of the water over that saddle as the dam suddenly burst and all the water let out numerous times. There's beach marks and things of that sort that are visible here on the side of Mount Jumbo. Mount Jumbo itself had an Indian name that was called Obstacle. And behind me you'll notice a white quartz fireplace. It turns out that Jumbo was created by an igneous rock intrusion through some sedimentary features below it, and this ore that you see behind this, in particular some of the blue marks, and if you look carefully you'll see specks of copper ore and even a little bit of gold, if you know what you're looking for. Well, these features were discovered about 1860, 1870 by prospectors who actually developed several mines in this immediate area. The mines were not particularly productive, but it's interesting, I think, to people to know that there were gold mines literally within walking distance of the city of Missoula. And this fireplace was all built out of ore from a couple of those gold mines on Mount Jumbo. As I mentioned, this was a thoroughfare, and in the old days, of course, everybody was on foot or later horseback. Rather than going around Mount Jumbo and going through this notorious Hellgate Canyon below us, which was a pretty wild ambush site, a lot of people would travel up over the top of the saddle of Mount Jumbo. And in fact, the original trail through here was over the saddle, followed along the north foothills north of Missoula. The trail eventually came out about where the BFI dump is now, and then skirted along the foothills on towards the west. One fork went up north, up towards Evero in that direction. The other one went west. People avoided the river bottoms because of ambushes, because they were full of downfall and brush and other things. If you stayed up on the side hills, you didn't have all that vegetation in your way, and you could also see where people were possibly going to be ahead of you to attack you. And finally, it was a straight line. If you had to go around a mountain, sometimes it was just easier to go over a low spot in it than go several miles out of your way when you're walking. Lewis and Clark came to Missoula. They split up at Travelers Rest. Lewis went north towards Great Falls, and he went right through this property on his travels, and proceeded on up the Blackfoot to Great Falls. Clark went south and through the Big Hole and out that way. Of course, right after Lewis and Clark, we started seeing an influx of other whites into this area. This area was a main thoroughfare for white men as it had been for Indians before, including the trail over the top of Mount Jumbo, which came to be known as the old trail to Walla Walla. Well, part of the reason that they took that trail was down at the bottom of the hill by the old cookhouse are some cliffs along the highway, and you couldn't go next to the river. You had to come partway up the hill to get around the river. That came to be known as Marshall Grade. Marshall Grade was named after a fellow by the name of Marshall, who was a Civil War veteran. Marshall got some scrip from the government in exchange for his service in the Civil War, and he came west sometime around 1865 and settled in this valley below us. The region or the area came to be known after him. Marshall Creek, Marshall Grade. Marshall didn't stay around too terrible long, probably 5 or 10 years. He got a patent on about 120 acres in the bottom down here, including what's now got the old cookhouse on it. Marshall eventually sold out to a fellow by the name of DeLong. DeLong lived there probably 15 years, developed a lot of features, including a irrigation ditch that comes out of Marshall Creek and irrigates that bottom. I still obtain water rights from that ditch, and my water right dates to September of 1865, which gives you some notion of how long this area has actually been under agriculture and settled. DeLong eventually sold out, and the property was bought about 1890 or so by a family by the name of Lurch. Someplace along in there, they've built a brick kiln and fired bricks, and then built from those bricks that were fired right on the site and made from clay right on the site, made the old Cook farmhouse, which was built, I think, about 1885, 1886. The area, of course, was surveyed by the U.S. government in about 1870, and I actually have the original U.S. government survey of this particular area. The survey, unfortunately, the section line runs right through the property, but if you see this mark here, you'll see it's a bend in the river right down here by the Deer Creek Road. There is this would be where East Missoula is, and you'll notice right here a little squiggly line. Well, that's actually the fence line that was between the DeLong property and the property to the south of it. Before there was a survey, a lot of these fences, as you can see, were erected in places that obviously didn't follow the section lines. That fence line is now what we call Edgewood Drive. And this dotted line that you see going up through here is the old trail to Walla Walla. The dark line that follows through here is the Mullen Road. Mullen was commissioned by Congress in 1859 to build a military road between Fort Benton, Montana, and Walla Walla, Washington. And Mullen developed and made the road over what's now called Marshall Grade, although that location has changed a couple times over the years. You can still see portions of the old original Mullen Road, which is very steep down there. But this is the Mullen Road, and of course parts of it still exist west of Missoula on what we still call Mullen. Missoula in 1871 was about 2 blocks, which is right in the intersection of what is now Front Street and Higgins Avenue. But Front Street in those days was the Mullen Road. The original white settlement in this area was actually Hellgate, which was about 5 miles west of town, but was moved in the 1860s to the location that Missoula is at now. Now this particular property, as I say, was settled by a fellow named Marshall. It was sold to DeLongs, eventually purchased by the Lurches. My family bought some land that was at one time part of that place, but was split off sometime around 1870. And most of this area was either patented from the government as settlement claims, or quite a bit of Mount Jumbo was actually given to the railroad, since they got every other section within 20 miles of the center line of the railroad in exchange for building those railroads. And of course, over the years, they sold a lot of that property to settlers and others. Moving into more historic times then, the Mullen Road and the Marshall Grade Road was eventually abandoned about 1924, 1925, and the road was placed down below where previously a railroad tracks had run. The railroad came through in about 1886 and initially actually went across the river, across what's called Bamman Flats. They had a bridge where the Deer Creek Bridge is, and they had another one east of there, sort of about halfway between Marshall Canyon and the town pump that sits there now. Those bridges, for some reason, were abandoned, and they moved over here about 1895, put in the railroad grade down where the highway is now, and continued to operate those until the 1908 floods, when a lot of the railroad bridges were washed out, including the one on Marshall Creek. So they then moved over to the location that they're at now, next to Mount Sentinel. Since that railroad grade was there, and actually was subsequently used by a streetcar that ran until about 1939 from Missoula to Bonner, the highway department in the mid-20s decided to put the highway down there too, and did. After that, the old Marshall Grade Road was abandoned as a county road, although I now use it as my driveway to my house. The area has been historically agricultural. When my family moved out here in 1945, there were 2 places, the Lurch place and our place. Our place had been built in the 1920s by a family named Thomas, and we were the only ones out there. There wasn't anybody around between East Missoula and the bottom of Marshall Canyon. My dad started selling property off in the 60s because he was a rancher and found that he could buy land elsewhere for 10 acres for what he could sell 1 acre for here. And so he started doing that. And by 1968, he had sold most of our bottomland in 10-acre parcels. Meanwhile, the Lurch family kind of dissipated, and eventually the old widow, Lydia Lurch, was left living alone on the property, and sold it to a fellow by the name of Russ Price sometime in the 70s. Now Russ farmed it for a few years and then decided that farming wasn't worth his while and decided to subdivide it, and did. Unfortunately, just about the time he decided to do that, the real estate market in Missoula went bust, and you couldn't hardly give land away because he had all these dollars invested in improvements. He had to seek money and eventually traded the subdivision for some ranch land in North Idaho to an outfit called Appleway Chevrolet, which is over in Spokane. Appleway completed the subdivision, completed developing the property. They needed some access, and so I traded them access on what's now Edgewood Drive, which I had an easement on, in exchange for my easement across their property on what's now Old Marshall Grade Road, although it was the old county road to begin with. I also connected into their municipal water system. I built this house in 1978 and originally used a spring for water. But after I connected in, then I brought water from the municipal system. The Cook place, incidentally, was spring-fed water. And the spring's still there. In fact, I've developed it and use it for stock water now. But for 120 years, they used that spring for the domestic water. Came down the hill in a pipe, went through the house, and then out of the house, and in front of the house where you see that sign, the historical monument. It's in a square concrete thing. Well, that was actually a watering trough, and the spring came out into that watering trough, and that's where that came from and what it was all about. When the Prices bought the place, they decided they didn't want to be drinking water out of a spring and drilled a well. That place has gone from 125 acres when they bought it down to I think the owners now have 5 acres. And I've always regretted, frankly, that I didn't buy it and keep it in some kind of agricultural use, because it is a unique and interesting old property. The house I was raised in is still there, although it's been remodeled. And we had a large white barn and a bunch of outbuildings. The barn burned down in the middle of the night after my dad sold it, and never could figure out exactly what the reason for the fire was, but it did burn. And now I bought some land from my dad and bought part of the old Lurch place from Russ Price, and then later Appleway Chevrolet. So I now have 105 acres here that I live in. I located this house where I did because there was a spring here for water. Also, when I was a kid, we had a Boy Scout camp right here, and about where I'm standing, I actually had a little log cabin, and so I always had some connection to this particular place, and intend to live here for the rest of my life. So, in a nutshell, that's kind of a quick rundown of the area and a little bit about it.
More, highly commercial.
Got the best and earliest photo I could find of this particular area. It's not perfect because it's focused a little bit to the east. It's taken from Mount Sentinel, and it's looking down towards what's now East Missoula. That large flat vacant area in the middle is what's now East Missoula. The line, the heavier kind of whiter line that you see that edges around the base of Mount Jumbo, and then kind of to the left, I guess, of the East Missoula area is actually the Northern Pacific Railroad right away. So I know the photo was taken after the railroad came in 1886, but my guess is it's probably about 1890. You don't see much development in Hellgate Canyon. It looks like there could possibly be a plowed field there right where the river meanders, which is an interesting feature in itself. That's actually an old slump, that was created on the side of Mount Sentinel, and that's what pushed the river around like that. Probably a feature left over from Glacial Lake Missoula. But Hughes Gardens, which was in existence in that area from probably the 1880s until really the 1970s, it was obviously just being developed at the time this photo was taken. And then to the right of that flat area that's now East Missoula, you see kind of a darker line running through there. That actually was the Mullen Road, which is now what's called Speedway through East Missoula. And then of course it came around and eventually connected to what's now called Marshall Grade. Probably it was in those days too. But as you can see, at that point in time, the area was vacant. This is a photograph of my paternal great-grandparents. It was their wedding picture taken here in Missoula about 1890. So I've still got a couple pictures of her holding me when I was an infant. But that was her wedding picture, and he was already a second-generation Missoulian in 1890. Okay, well, these are pictures on my maternal grandmother's side. Again, from the early Missoula days, the picture with the people in the buggy was actually taken up Miller Creek at a ranch my grandmother's family had up there. About 1905, some of my grandmother's aunts are photographed in the kind of oval picture, and my grandmother's parents are actually in the tintype, which is probably very dark and you won't be able to pick up. But that was again taken in Missoula. Their name was Mix, and they actually had a grocery store on the south side of the river in the area of 3rd Street. And then some more of the, well, my grandmother is the second person in the square photo, the one in the darker dress. Everybody else is wearing white.